In this video, we'll be looking at the principles of Australia's government, or in other words, the other things that our government is based on, such as important principles and beliefs other than democracy and the Westminster system, which was touched on in Lesson 1. So there are 4 underlying principles that we're going to look at as part of the 10 Civics course. The first is the governments must protect the rights and freedoms of individuals. And this is really in relation to that term we learnt yesterday, which was liberal democracy. So we'll be expanding upon that idea in this video. Number 2, governments must make laws that reflect the views and values of people. So the prevailing views and values of people who will then elect them into office or judge them on their performance. Number 3, governments must be accountable to the people. Now, first and foremost, they're accountable through elections, but, more recently we've seen in the news that there are other ways in which governments can be held to account, including in the media and by direct protest. And finally, there must be separation of powers. So we'll learn about the concept of separation of powers, something that is vital to our democracy. First off, governments must protect the rights and freedoms of the individual. So like I mentioned, this is really about that concept of liberal democracy. So this system aims to protect individual rights and freedoms. And some of those freedoms might include free speech. Another thing that might be included is, the right for assembly or to form different groups and political parties. Another freedom might be a freedom of movement, which we actually saw restricted during the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly with WA's hard border. The other aspect of liberal democracy, outside of the protection of rights and freedoms, is the limit on the level of government control or interference. Anything that really tries to inhibit one of these rights or freedoms is said to be excessive use of government control or interference. Now, really, there's a lot of debate about this principle because even though the government needs to regulate the behaviour of people to keep people safe, to stop hate speech, to stop discrimination in our society, they also shouldn't be too excessive in doing so. So really is, a little bit of a Goldilocks zone. Goldilocks, we're all familiar with the story of Goldilocks, not too excessive, not too lenient, and really aiming for that golden mean or the golden area in which governments will try to operate. And that's really often, a really tough tightrope for them to walk. We have some examples here of freedoms. So we have laws that protect our broad right to freedom of speech, basic right to freedom of assembly and expression, and that limit individuals from behaving in an offensive or an indecent manner in public. And we'll be going through some of those examples in class. Number 2, governments must make laws that reflect the views and values of people. So this is that concept of representative government. So we elect representatives to make laws for us, but in turn, we expect those representatives to make laws that actually reflect our views and values. We don't expect our representatives to just base their decisions on their own opinion. Now, this works very well in theory, but as we know, all politicians are aligned to a particular political party. So if they have views that contradict that political party's line, they're unlikely to vote in their own personal opinion anyway. So there might be some conflict between the views of society and what a particular political party sees. We do aim to have representative government by holding free and fair elections every 3 years federally, 4 years in the states, where people can vote for individuals to represent them. Now, this is important in Australia because we have compulsory voting, which means that everyone over the age of 18 who is an Australian citizen must vote. Otherwise, you are subject to fines. And there are obviously advantages and disadvantages for that. Advantages of compulsory voting, as it says down here, really ensures that we have a majority of people, not just those who voted, which is the case in a system like the United States or the UK. And it may also force candidates, political parties, to consider the needs of all society, which is actually, a definite benefit to our community as a whole. Arguments against forces those who are uninterested to cast an ill-informed vote or a donkey vote, and it can be viewed as a violation of individual rights. It could be viewed as an overly excessive government control. Number 3, governments must be accountable to the people. Now, there are a couple of different ways in which this can occur. The first is elections, which we have already mentioned, right? Now, at election time, governments really need to be able to justify their actions and decisions to voters. Otherwise, people won't vote for them, right? So that's fairly logical. Another way that governments are held to account is through question time. Question time, if you're not aware, occurs when Parliament is sitting, and it's an opportunity for the opposition and members of the crossbench to ask questions of the government and why they're making particular decisions. We'll watch this video in class for some highlights of question time, because it can often get quite intense as debate and arguments are very rigorous and highly emotional. The principle of responsible government also ensures that our government is accountable by stating that any member or government who acts in a dishonourable or irresponsible manner has a duty to resign from their position. The most recent government minister, at the time of recording, who has had to resign was Bridget McKenzie over a scandal which was seeing the allocation of funds to safe Liberal seats known in a program known as Sports Rorts. We'll have a look at that in class, but as we know, there are government MPs and opposition MPs that are under pressure all the time. They may or may not resign, depending on the government or the opposition party's particular stance. Finally, there must be separation of powers. So separation of powers, as a definition, really means that no single group or body within our parliamentary system, i.e. the government, Parliament or the courts, has power over both the political and the legal systems. So these things need to be separate to ensure that no one group gets too much power. So the 3 main powers at the federal level of government consist of executive power. Executive power is the power to administer or implement the law, really is held by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, but also in a ceremonial sense by the Governor-General. Legislative power, which is the power to make the law, held by Parliament. All members of Parliament can actually put forward a bill to become law. Whether or not it gets voted through or not depends on the majority of votes. Finally, we have judicial power, which is the power to apply and interpret the law, which is held by the courts, allows them to enforce the law and to settle disputes. These 3 powers are separated in the Australian Constitution, but there is some overlap, as the executive, which is the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, executive, excuse my typing, executive sits in Parliament. So there is a little bit of crossover in our systems because there's a little bit of overlap between the executive and legislative powers. This diagram illustrates separation of powers to really great effect. We can see that the legislature is separate to the executive, which is separate to the judiciary. But as I already mentioned, there is a little bit of overlap in the Australian system between the legislature and the executive, because the Prime Minister and the senior ministers actually sit in either the House of Representatives, which the Prime Minister would definitely be in, but some ministers may either be in the upper house or the lower house.